In the dead of night, when the Maryland moon hung low and red like a fresh wound, a woman slipped through the cypress swamps with 7 souls trailing behind her, their breath shallow, their chains long since broken but still rattling in their minds. The year was 1857, and every hound in 3 counties had her scent. The reward on her head had climbed to $40,000, dead or alive didn't matter much to the men who wrote the notices. They called her Moses. They called her a thief. They never called her by the name the slavers branded on her, Minty. The air in the Bucktown village store was thick with the smell of tobacco juice, molasses, and the sour sweat of men who believed they owned the world. It was a late autumn evening in 1835, and 13-year-old Araminta Ross, called Minty by everyone who thought they had the right to shorten her name, stood rigid beside the long wooden counter, her bare feet cold against the puncheon floor. She had been rented out again, this time to a man named Anthony, a small-time planter with a quick hand and a quicker temper. Her job tonight was simple: stand still, keep quiet, and tend to whatever small chore the white woman inside demanded while the men haggled over barrels of flour and salt pork. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the argument was rising. A young field hand from a neighboring farm had slipped away from his overseer to buy something, nobody ever said what, and now the overseer, a heavy, red-faced man with a beard like rust, had come storming in to drag the boy back. The enslaved boy, no older than 16, stood trembling near the door, eyes wide, knowing what waited for him when he crossed the threshold again. The overseer reached for him, fingers hooking into the collar of the boy's Osnaburg shirt. Minty didn't think. She never remembered thinking. She only remembered moving. One moment she was beside the counter, the next she was between the overseer and the boy, her small body a sudden, impossible wall. The white woman screamed something, the storekeeper shouted, but Minty had already stepped out onto the porch behind the fleeing boy, following him into the dusk because something in her chest said run, because something deeper said shield. The overseer followed, cursing, and in his right hand swung the 2-pound lead weight he used to balance scales. He raised it high, meaning to bring it down on the escaping boy's skull. The boy ducked. Minty did not. The weight caught her full across the left side of her head, just above the temple. There was a sound like a green melon splitting on stone. The world exploded into white fire and then into nothing. She fell straight backward onto the frozen ground, blood pouring from her scalp, her ears, her nose. The overseer stared for one stunned second, then spat and walked away, dragging the other boy by the arm. No one ran for a doctor. Doctors cost money, and Minty belonged to Edward Brodess, who was already complaining that this particular piece of property was more trouble than she was worth. They carried her home on a blanket, her body jerking with convulsions, blood soaking through the coarse wool and dripping onto the frost. Her mother, Rit, screamed until her voice cracked, rocking her unconscious child in the corner of the dirt-floored cabin while her father, Ben, stood helpless in the doorway. For days she lay between life and death, burning with fever, her breathing shallow and wet. Brodess came once, looked at the girl twitching on the pallet, and told Rit to pray she died quick so he wouldn't have to feed a damaged slave all winter. But Minty did not die. On the 7th day the bleeding stopped. On the 10th day her eyes opened, black and huge and strangely calm, as if she had been somewhere far away and had only just decided to come back. The fracture ran from her forehead to the base of her skull, pieces of bone had to be picked out of her hair for weeks afterward. She would never again be able to wear a headscarf tight the way other women did, the pressure made her vomit. For the rest of her life the scar would throb when storms came, and bright sunlight would feel like needles driven into her brain. Then the sleeping sickness began. Without warning she would drop where she stood, at the washtub, in the cornfield, once in the middle of the tobacco barn with a lantern in her hand that shattered and nearly set the whole crop ablaze. She would fall into a darkness so complete that no shaking or shouting could reach her, her body stiff as a corpse, her pulse barely there. Minutes, sometimes hours later she would wake gasping, covered in dew or rain or whatever the weather had thrown on her while she was gone. People began to whisper that part of her soul had stayed on the other side of that blow. And then came the visions. The first one hit her while she was hoeing Brodess's garden. The sky cracked open like a door, and light poured down so bright she had to cover her face. A voice, not heard with ears but felt in the marrow, spoke her name, the real name no slaver had ever been given. It showed her things, roads she had never walked, rivers she had never seen, white men with rifles who would fall asleep at the exact moment she needed to pass. It showed her chains falling away from wrists that looked like her own, and a multitude of dark faces turning northward under a sky full of stars that pointed like arrows. She told no one at first. You did not speak of such things where white ears might hear. But the visions kept coming, fiercer each time, until she understood they were not dreams. They were orders. The God of her mother's hushed prayers, the God of the invisible church in the pine thickets, had looked into the cracked vessel of her skull and chosen to live there. The girl who had once been Minty Ross was gone, shattered with that iron weight. What rose from the blood-soaked ground was something new, something terrible and holy, something that would one day make slaveholders wake screaming from nightmares of a small black woman with a pistol and a promise. The summer of 1849 hung heavy over Dorchester County, the kind of heat that made the tobacco leaves droop and the white men meaner than usual. Edward Brodess was dead, carried off by something quick and ugly, and his widow Eliza was scrambling to pay debts the only way a Maryland slaveholder knew how, by selling flesh. Word came down through the quarters like poison in the well water. The auction block in Cambridge was hungry, and the traders from Georgia and Mississippi were already sniffing around, measuring arms and teeth, talking about how deep the cotton needed hands that winter. Minty heard it first from her sister Mary's husband, a freeman named John Tubman who came riding in at dusk with the news clenched in his jaw. Brodess's estate had scheduled a sale for the first week of October. Minty, her two brothers Henry and Ben, and a handful of others were on the list. Once the hammer fell, the deep South swallowed you whole. No one came back from Natchez or the Mississippi Delta with stories of hope. They came back, if at all, in pine boxes or as ghosts who had forgotten their own names. She was 27 years old, small, scarred, subject to the sleeping spells that still dropped her without mercy. She had a husband now, John Tubman, 5 years her senior, broad-shouldered and legally free, who told her plainly that if she ran he would not follow. I got papers, he said, tapping the folded document inside his coat. You run alone. He said it kindly, the way a man might warn a child not to touch fire. But Minty had already been touched by fire. The visions had grown sharper since the iron weight. They came in the fields now, sudden as lightning, showing her a road north bordered by black gum trees, a ferry crossing where the boatman would look the other way for a silver dollar, a Quaker woman in a gray dress who would open a certain green-painted door at the exact stroke of midnight. The voice that spoke inside the visions never asked. It commanded. She began preparing in ways no one noticed. A pinch of salt here, a strip of dried beef there, hidden inside the rafters of the cookhouse. She memorized every slaver's patrol route, every barking dog between Poplar Neck and the Delaware line. She sang certain hymns when white folks were near, hymns whose words had two meanings, letting the other enslaved know something was coming. I'm sorry, Lord, I'm sorry, she would sing, soft and mournful, but the ones who knew heard the rest. I'm going. Don't wait for me. On the night she chose, the sky was clouded over, no moon, no stars, just a low wet darkness that swallowed sound. Her brothers met her behind the corn crib, faces pale with terror. Henry carried a small bundle, Ben had nothing but the clothes on his back. They were supposed to leave at the first rooster crow, but the roosters never crowed. Instead, somewhere around 3 in the morning, Henry looked at the black wall of woods and whispered that he couldn't do it. His wife and children were still back in the quarter. If he was caught gone, they would pay. Ben followed his brother's lead, tears shining on his cheeks. They turned back, melting into the night like smoke. Minty stood alone. For one heartbeat she felt the old fear rise, the fear that had kept millions bent under the lash. Then the voice inside the cracked place in her skull spoke, not gentle, not kind, but iron hard, go. She stepped off the plantation road and into the marsh. The mud sucked at her ankles, mosquitoes whined in clouds, but she kept moving, following a path only she could see. 90 miles lay between her and Pennsylvania. 90 miles of patrollers on horseback, bloodhounds, rivers without bridges, and a brand new fugitive slave law breathing down every black traveler's neck. She slept in hollow logs, ate berries that tore her mouth, crossed streams so cold her legs went numb to the hip. Once she hid inside a potato hole while riders passed inches from her face, their horses snorting steam in the dawn. She whispered psalms until the danger passed, then crawled out and kept north. When she reached the Pennsylvania line, the sun was coming up red over the hills. She stepped across, no fence, no marker, just a line on some white man's map, and stood there shaking, not from cold but from the impossible weight of being on soil where no one could legally own her. She raised her hands to the sky, palms raw and bleeding, and laughed until she cried. Then she knelt and kissed the ground, tasting freedom and dirt and her own salt tears all at once. In that moment, alone on a lonely road with nothing but the clothes on her back and the vision still burning behind her eyes, Araminta Ross understood something that would haunt slaveholders for the next 13 years. She was not finished. One woman's freedom was a grain of sand against the mountain of chains still clanking in Maryland. She wiped her face, stood up, turned south again in her mind, and made a promise no one heard but God and the morning wind. She was coming back. Philadelphia in the winter of 1850 was a city of contrasts for a woman like Harriet Tubman. The air smelled of coal smoke and river ice, streets bustling with free black folks who owned shops, preached in churches, and walked without looking over their shoulders. Harriet had found work as a domestic, scrubbing floors and cooking for white families who paid her actual wages, coins she could feel heavy in her pocket, not just promises scratched on a ledger. She had a room in a boarding house run by abolitionists, a bed that was hers alone, and for the first time in her life, no overseer's bell clanging at dawn. But sleep came hard. The visions that had guided her north now pulled her south, showing her the faces of her family still chained in Maryland, her sister Mary Ann, her nieces and nephews playing in the dirt while the auction block loomed like a guillotine. News from down the Chesapeake came in whispers through the Underground Railroad network, Quakers passing letters, black sailors smuggling word from Baltimore. Eliza Brodess was still selling off the estate piece by piece. Mary Ann's husband had heard the traders talking, the children were next. Harriet sat in her room one night, staring at the candle flame until it burned low, the voice in her head repeating like a drum, "Go back. Get them out." She knew the risks. Congress had just passed the Fugitive Slave Act in September, a devil's bargain to keep the Union from splintering. Now, federal marshals could hunt escaped slaves anywhere, even in free states. Bounty hunters prowled Philadelphia's alleys, kidnapping free blacks with forged papers and dragging them south to be sold. One wrong glance, one suspicious white man, and Harriet could wake up in chains on a Georgia rice field. But the visions didn't care about laws written by men who owned other men. They showed her the path, a steamer to Wilmington, then overland through Delaware's backcountry, hiding in barns and root cellars run by the network. She saved her wages, bought a suit of men's clothes to disguise herself as a sailor, tucked a small pistol into her belt, the first gun she'd ever owned, cold and heavy against her hip. Friends in the Vigilance Committee begged her not to go. "You're free now," they said. "Stay and live." Harriet looked at them with those dark, unblinking eyes, the scar on her forehead pulsing with an old ache. "I'll die before I let them stay slaves," she replied, her voice flat as hammered steel. She left before Christmas, the Delaware River half-frozen, her breath fogging in the hold of the ship. In Wilmington, she met a contact, a white farmer with a lantern signal, who hid her in his wagon under hay bales that scratched her skin raw. From there, it was footpaths through pine barrens, wading creeks to throw off dogs, sleeping in ditches with leaves for cover. The cold bit deep, but she pressed on, the North Star hidden behind clouds but etched in her mind. By the time she reached Dorchester County, snow dusted the tobacco fields like ash on a grave. Mary Ann's cabin was a low-slung shadow at the edge of the Ross plantation. Harriet waited until midnight, then scratched at the door like a cat. Her sister opened it, eyes wide with terror turning to disbelief. "Minty," she whispered, using the old name. Harriet pulled her inside, explained the plan in hurried words, the children bundled in quilts, no lanterns, no noise. They had to move now. Patrols were thick since the new law, rewards doubled for runaways. The oldest niece, barely 6, clutched a rag doll. Harriet told her to leave it, too much weight, too much risk. They slipped out the back, into the swamp where cypress knees tripped the unwary and alligators slept in the muck. The journey north was a nightmare of close calls. Once, near the state line, a patroller's horse whinnied not 10 feet away. Harriet pressed the children's faces into the wet earth, her hand over their mouths, whispering prayers until the rider passed. Another time, her narcolepsy struck mid-crossing of a shallow ford. She dropped like a stone into the water, waking sputtering with her sister hauling her up, the current nearly carrying off one of the boys. Bounty posters with her description were nailed to trees. Runaway Negro woman, scar on forehead, subject to fits, $100 reward. She tore them down when she could, burned them in hidden fires. When they finally crossed into Pennsylvania after weeks of evasion, the children collapsing in exhaustion at a safe house in Chester County, Harriet knelt and thanked the God who had spoken through her cracked skull. Mary Ann wept, holding her babies close. Word spread through the abolitionist circles. The small woman from Maryland had gone back into hell and brought out souls. They started calling her Moses then, after the biblical liberator who led his people out of Egypt. Harriet didn't correct them. This was just the beginning. Over the next decade, she would make 19 trips south, guiding 70 people to freedom, never losing a single one. Each return was a defiance, a spit in the eye of the slave power that thought laws could chain the human spirit. In choosing to go back that first time, Harriet Tubman didn't just save her family, she ignited a revolution in miniature, proving that one woman's will could crack the foundations of an empire built on blood and bondage. The South Carolina Lowcountry in the spring of 1863 was a fever dream of rebellion and rot, where the Combahee River wound through rice paddies like a serpent drunk on Confederate blood. The Civil War had turned the tidewater plantations into armed camps, with enslaved black workers toiling under the lash to feed the rebel army, their backs bent over dikes and sluices that turned swamps into fortunes. Harriet Tubman, now 41 and a ghost to the slaveholders who still offered thousands for her head, had crossed into Union lines 2 years earlier, slipping through pickets with intelligence gathered from her Underground Railroad days. She arrived in Beaufort with nothing but her visions, her scar, and a reputation that made white officers uneasy. General David Hunter, commanding the Department of the South, saw potential in this small, illiterate woman who spoke with the authority of prophets. He made her a scout, a spy, paying her $30 a month to map the rivers, befriend the contrabands, escape slaves flooding Union camps, and whisper secrets about Confederate defenses. But Harriet wanted more than whispers. The visions had shown her flames licking at mansion roofs, chains melting in bonfires, hundreds of her people streaming toward gunboats under a moonless sky. She pushed Hunter and his successor, Rufus Saxton, for action. "Give me soldiers," she said, "and I'll bring out the harvest." By May, she had convinced Colonel James Montgomery, a Kansas abolitionist with a taste for guerrilla warfare, to let her plan a raid up the Combahee. It would be no quiet extraction like her Maryland runs. This was war, sanctioned by Lincoln's army, aimed at the heart of the planter class. Harriet recruited spies from the contraband camps, black men and women who knew every back channel and hidden path. She mapped torpedo mines in the river, scouted rebel pickets, and spread word through coded hymns sung in the rice fields, "Wade in the water, children, God's gonna trouble the water." The enslaved listened, they knew Moses was coming. On the night of June 1st, 3 federal gunboats, the John Adams, the Harriet A. Weed, and the Sentinel, steamed up from Beaufort Harbor, loaded with 150 soldiers from the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, all black men, many former slaves themselves. Harriet stood on the deck of the John Adams, dressed in a calico skirt and bandana, her Navy revolver holstered at her side, a shawl hiding ammunition. The river was black as pitch, alive with the croak of bullfrogs and the distant crack of whips. Montgomery commanded the troops, but everyone knew this was Harriet's raid. She had chosen the landing points, timed the tides to avoid mines, and promised the soldiers divine protection. As the boats churned upstream, she led them in song, her voice low and steady. Of all the whole creation in the east or in the west, the glorious Yankee nation is the greatest and the best. It wasn't just morale, the hymns masked the engine noise from shore batteries. Dawn broke on June 2nd as they hit the first plantation, Hayward's sprawling estate where rice barns groaned with Confederate stores. Harriet signaled from the pilot house, and the troops poured ashore, bayonets fixed. Gunfire erupted, rebel overseers firing from horseback, but the Union men were faster, trained in the swamps. Harriet directed from the boat, pointing out hidden paths where enslaved workers were already fleeing their cabins, bundles on their backs, children in arms. "Come aboard," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Hundreds came running, wading into the shallows, clambering onto the decks until the gunboats listed under the weight. One woman carried twins in a basket, another dragged a pig by the ear. The soldiers torched the rice mills, the barns, the big houses, flames roaring up to swallow silk curtains and mahogany beds. Confederate cavalry arrived too late, their horses bogged in the mud. Union sharpshooters picked them off from the boats. They hit plantation after plantation, Combahee Ferry, Fields Point, Tar Bluff, liberating over 750 people in hours, the largest single emancipation by force in American history. Harriet moved among the freed on the overcrowded decks, calming babies with hardtack, tending wounds with herbs from her pouch. One boat nearly grounded under the load. She ordered men overboard to push, pistol in hand to ward off stragglers. By midday, the sky was thick with smoke, the air stinking of burning cotton and freedom. Rebel reinforcements fired from the banks, but Harriet's scouts had warned of their positions. The gunboats' howitzers answered, shells bursting over the trees. She lost no one, not a soldier, not a fugitive. As they steamed back to Beaufort, the decks awash with river water and tears, Harriet stood at the rail, watching the inferno recede. Millions in Confederate property gone, rice, cotton, horses, all confiscated or destroyed. Newspapers would call it a triumph. Southern planters wailed of that devil woman who had turned their world to ash. This raid shattered illusions. Harriet wasn't just a conductor sneaking souls north, she was a general, the first woman to lead U.S. troops in combat, her strategy flawless, her resolve biblical. Lincoln's army had armed black men, but Harriet armed the revolution itself, proving enslaved people would rise if given the spark. Her visions had come true again, the voice in her cracked skull vindicated in Fire and Exodus. The winter of 1913 gripped Auburn, New York, with a cold that seeped through the cracks of the Harriet Tubman home for the aged, infirm, and indigent Negroes, a brick building she had founded herself on land bought with her own hard-earned dollars from years of lecturing and odd jobs after the war. At 91, Harriet lay in a narrow iron bed in the upstairs room, her body a map of old battles, the scar on her forehead from the iron weight still visible under thinning gray hair, her hands gnarled from decades of gripping reins, pistols, and the arms of fleeing slaves. Pneumonia had come for her like an old enemy, rattling in her chest with every shallow breath, but she fought it the way she had fought everything, fiercely, without surrender. Around her bed clustered the remnants of her life, her adopted daughter Gertie, now middle-aged and weeping quietly, nieces and nephews she had smuggled north in the dead of night, former fugitives who owed their freedom to her raids, their faces lined with gratitude and grief. The room smelled of camphor and wood smoke from the stove downstairs, where volunteers kept a pot of broth simmering, though Harriet hadn't eaten in days. Doctors came and went, white men in stiff collars who shook their heads at this stubborn old woman who refused their modern remedies. One, a young physician from Syracuse, offered morphine to ease the pain that twisted her frame, the agony from old injuries flaring with each cough. "It'll let you rest, Mrs. Tubman," he said, holding the syringe like a peace offering. Harriet's eyes, still sharp as a hawk's despite the haze of fever, fixed on him. She raised a trembling hand, waving it away. "No," she rasped, her voice a whisper of thunder from a distant storm. I want to be wide awake when I meet my God and account for every soul I brought out. The doctor blinked, and used to defiance from a bedridden patient, but those who knew her only nodded. This was the same woman who had crossed enemy lines during the war, scouting for Union generals with nothing but her visions and a Bowie knife, the same who had led the Combahee Raid, freeing 700 in one fiery night, the same who had made 19 trips back into slave country, pistol cocked, ready to shoot any who faltered and risked the group. Morphine. That was for the weak, for those who hadn't stared down bloodhounds and bounty hunters. She would face her maker clear-eyed, tallying the lives she had stolen from bondage like beads on a rosary. As the days blurred into nights, illuminated only by the flicker of kerosene lamps, stories filled the room. Gertie recounted the time Harriet had hidden in a swamp for days, living on roots while patrols thrashed the underbrush. A tall man with a limp, one of the Combahee survivors, spoke of standing on the gunboat deck, watching plantations burn as Harriet sang hymns to calm the terrified. They laughed through tears at how she had once disguised herself as an old chicken seller to spy on Confederate camps, clucking at hens while memorizing troop movements. Harriet listened, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes drifting into one of her old spells. Not the narcolepsy now, but reveries where the voice that had guided her since girlhood spoke again, showing flashes of rivers crossed, chains broken, faces turned toward the North Star. She murmured prayers, fragments of psalms that had been her armor. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Visitors came from afar, suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, who owed Harriet for her work in the women's rights movement, Union veterans who saluted her as General Tubman, the title Lincoln's men had given her. Even reporters lurked outside, scribbling notes for obituaries that would sanitize her story, turning the revolutionary into a kindly auntie for schoolbooks. But in that room, the truth hung heavy as the quilts piled on her bed. Harriet had never been kindly in the way white America wanted. She had been a terror to slaveholders, a woman who carried a gun and used it, who threatened to kill deserters on the Underground Railroad to protect the mission. Her life was a litany of defiances, escaping alone at 27, returning again and again, arming black troops during the war, fighting for a pension as a veteran when the government dragged its feet because she was black and a woman. Now, on this deathbed, she defied ease, choosing pain as her final companion. As March 10th dawned gray and sleeting, her breathing grew labored, each inhale a victory. The family drew closer, holding her hands, singing the old spirituals she loved, swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Harriet's eyes fluttered open one last time, focusing on the faces around her, the souls she had led out of Egypt. She whispered, lips barely moving, a battle cry softened by the years but undimmed in spirit, I go to prepare a place for you. It was a promise, echoing the words of Jesus, but laced with her own fire, the assurance that even in the hereafter, she would be waiting, path cleared, hand extended. Her chest rose once more, then stilled, the room falling silent except for the sobs and the sleet tapping at the window like impatient spirits.